The pain radiated through his body like liquid fire, each breath a desperate battle against the tons of American steel pressing down on his chest. The blood from his mangled legs formed dark pools in the frozen Belgian mud. Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich tried to call for help, but only managed a whisper as the modified Sherman tank, the 50th he had reinforced with his forbidden welding technique, continued to slowly crush what remained of his body against the frozen ground. Somewhere nearby, German artillery screamed overhead, and the frantic shouts of tankers preparing for the next wave echoed across the snow-covered repair yard. They needed him. These men had always needed him, but in saving countless others, he'd finally run out of miracles for himself. How does a man who gave everything to keep others alive end up dying alone in the mud, crushed by the very machines he had sworn to protect? The official engineering manual for the M4A3 Sherman tank explicitly prohibited field modifications to the armor plating. Page 47, paragraph 4 of the Ordnance Technical Service Guidelines stated clearly, "Under no circumstances shall field personnel attempt structural reinforcement of hull or turret assemblies." The tank's manufacturers and Army engineers had designed the armor according to precise specifications that balanced protection with mobility. Any alteration risked compromising the vehicle's structural integrity or creating dangerous spall fragments inside the crew compartment when hit. But what Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich understood, huddled in the frozen maintenance pits of the Ardennes forest in December of 1944, was that those engineering calculations didn't account for the German Panzerfaust rockets that were turning Shermans into coffins at an alarming rate. The cold numbers in those technical manuals couldn't hear the screams of tankers burning alive. The week before Christmas 1944, the massive German offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge had caught Allied forces completely unprepared. American armor units found themselves suddenly outnumbered and outgunned, facing German Tiger and Panther tanks whose heavy guns could penetrate a Sherman's armor at over 2,000 yards. The Sherman crews called their tanks Ronsons, after the popular lighter, with its slogan, "Lights first time, every time," a grim reference to how quickly they burst into flames when hit. Colonel James Patterson, commander of the 7th Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion, remembered the first time Aldrich approached him with his idea. "He came to me covered in grease and weld spatter, barely slept in 3 days. Said he'd figured out a way to reinforce the lower hull and ammunition storage areas without compromising mobility. I told him it was strictly against regulations. He just looked at me and asked how many more letters to parents I wanted to write that week." The Sherman's design flaw was fundamental. Its ammunition was stored in unprotected, wet storage racks along the hull floor where enemy fire could easily reach it. When a German shell penetrated, it often ignited the ammunition, causing catastrophic explosions that gave crews less than 90 seconds to escape. Survival rates were abysmal. 8 out of 10 Sherman tanks hit by German armor were completely destroyed, and 7 out of 10 crewmen inside those tanks died. Private First Class Thomas Weller, a tank driver who survived the Ardennes campaign, recalled, "We'd put sandbags on the floor, stack ammunition boxes differently, anything to give us a chance. None of it worked. Then Aldrich started pulling tanks into his maintenance bay, one by one. We didn't know what he was doing at first. All we knew was that tanks he worked on started coming back from engagements. Damaged, sure, but the crews were alive." Against direct orders, Aldrich had developed a dangerous and technically forbidden modification. Using salvaged armor plating from destroyed tanks and a custom welding technique he'd developed as a civilian engineer at the Packard Motor Plant in Detroit, he created angled deflection plates that he welded inside the lower hull. These deflection plates would redirect the energy of penetrating rounds away from the ammunition storage areas. Additionally, he reinforced the ammunition racks with a double-layer shell designed to contain explosions if they did occur. The work was brutal, painstaking, and technically illegal under Army regulations. Each tank required Aldrich to squeeze his 6'2" frame into the cramped interior, working in spaces barely 24 inches wide with a welding torch in freezing temperatures. Burns covered his hands and arms. The metal was so cold it would stick to bare skin, tearing it away when he moved. He worked 20 hours at a stretch, sleeping only when he physically collapsed. Master Sergeant William Hayes supervised the maintenance yard where Aldrich performed his modifications. The kid was destroying himself to save others. His hands were raw meat from the cold and the welding. When the torch would backfire in those tight spaces, it would burn his face, his neck. I ordered him to stop twice. He ignored me both times. I could have had him court-martialed, but then I saw a tank he'd modified come back from Bastogne. Direct hit from an 88, 4-inch hole in the side, but the ammunition didn't cook off. Entire crew walked away. After that, I just made sure he had the supplies he needed and looked the other way. By early January 1945, Aldrich had modified 43 Sherman tanks from 3 different armored divisions. Data collected from combat engagements showed that crews in Aldrich-modified tanks had a survival rate of 78% when hit by enemy fire, compared to less than 30% in unmodified tanks. His illegal modifications were saving lives in extraordinary numbers. Word spread through the tanker units. Commanders began specifically requesting that their tanks be sent to the Miracle Mechanics Pit before heading to the front. Tankers would bring him coffee, cigarettes, chocolate from their rations, anything to show their gratitude and ensure their tank made it onto his list. Some crews etched his initials into their tanks for luck. Others made unauthorized detours of up to 30 miles to have their tanks serviced by him specifically. He never talked much, remembered Sergeant Dan Cooper, a Sherman tank commander with the 2nd Armored Division. He'd just look at your tank, nod, and say, "Give me 8 hours." When you came back, he'd be inside another tank already, welding away, covered in sweat despite the cold. He had this haunted look. I found out later that his younger brother had been a tank gunner, killed when his Sherman caught fire after being hit at Normandy. Perhaps that explained his obsession. Colonel Harrison Mills, an ordnance officer who inspected maintenance operations in the European theater, discovered Aldrich's unauthorized modifications during a routine inspection in January 1945. According to his report, filed January 12th, he was prepared to have Aldrich arrested until he witnessed the arrival of 3 modified tanks returning from an engagement near St. Vith. All 3 had taken direct hits from German anti-tank weapons. All 3 crews had survived. "I was prepared to enforce regulations to the letter," Mills wrote in his report. "Then I watched as tankers embraced this grease-covered sergeant, some of them weeping openly. One officer told me bluntly that his entire crew would be dead if not for the modifications. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between enforcing our technical regulations and preserving the lives of our fighting men. I chose the latter and departed without filing charges." By mid-January, Aldrich had become something of a legend among the armored units fighting in the Ardennes. Tankers would tell stories about his modifications saving crews even after taking multiple direct hits. Some of the tales grew exaggerated in the telling. Claims that tanks he'd modified could withstand a direct hit from a Tiger's 88mm gun, or that German shells would bounce off his welding work. The truth was less miraculous, but no less impressive. His modifications significantly increased survival chances by protecting the most vulnerable areas. As January 1945 progressed, the Allied counteroffensive began pushing German forces back. The pace of combat accelerated, with armored units constantly on the move. Aldrich's maintenance bay became a round-the-clock operation. He trained 3 assistants, but insisted on personally overseeing the critical welding work on each tank. His health began to deteriorate visibly. He developed a persistent cough from inhaling welding fumes in confined spaces. The cold and lack of sleep left him feverish and disoriented. Private Henry Mills, one of Aldrich's assistants, described his condition. He was killing himself, plain and simple, sleeping maybe 2 hours a night on a cot right next to the tanks. He'd wake up coughing blood sometimes, wipe his mouth, and climb right back inside a tank. We begged him to rest, to let us handle some tanks. He'd just shake his head and say, "Not yet. Too many still need fixing." On January 24th, as the Allied push continued, Aldrich completed his 49th modification on a Sherman belonging to the 11th Armored Division. He had been working for 36 hours straight. Witnesses described him as barely able to stand, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his voice reduced to a rasp from the welding fumes. Yet when the 50th tank arrived, a battle-damaged M4A3E8 Easy 8 variant that had survived an engagement only because its main gun had managed to knock out the German panzer targeting it, Aldrich insisted on beginning work immediately. Lieutenant Robert Franklin, the tank's commander, tried to convince Aldrich to rest before starting. "He looked like a dead man walking," Franklin would later write in his personal diary. His eyes were hollow, his uniform stiff with frozen sweat and grease. "I told him my crew could wait, that we'd come back the next day. He just stared through me and said, 'There might not be a tomorrow for the next crew. We do it now.'" The temperature that night dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The maintenance pit was illuminated only by work lamps powered by sputtering generators. Aldrich worked alone, having sent his assistants to get a few hours' sleep. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, as he welded deflection plates inside the lower hull, something went catastrophically wrong. Accounts differ on exactly what happened. Some reports suggest the tank's hydraulic system failed due to the extreme cold, causing the massive vehicle to shift. Others believe that Aldrich, in his exhausted state, may have accidentally cut through a support member while welding. What is certain is that the 46-ton Sherman tank suddenly dropped, pinning Aldrich beneath it against the frozen ground of the maintenance pit. Private James Wilson, a sentry making his rounds, heard Aldrich's cries and ran to the pit. "I found him trapped under the tank, just his upper body visible," Wilson reported. "He was still conscious, still lucid. The first thing he said was, 'Don't move the tank yet. Get someone who knows what they're doing.' Even then, knowing he was dying, he was worried that if we moved the tank wrong, we'd damage the modifications he'd just completed." It took nearly 40 minutes to assemble a recovery team and the equipment needed to lift the massive tank. By the time they raised it enough to pull Aldrich free, he had been crushed for over an hour. His legs were completely shattered, his pelvis crushed, internal bleeding severe. Yet somehow he remained conscious, even continuing to give instructions about finishing the modifications on the tank that had crushed him. "Get Wilson to finish the upper deflection plate," he told Sergeant Hayes, his voice barely audible. "It needs a 3-degree angle or it won't deflect properly. The welds have to be continuous, no gaps. Promise me you'll finish it right." Aldrich was evacuated to a field hospital, but doctors there immediately recognized that his injuries were non-survivable. They made him comfortable with morphine and recorded his final statements. In his last hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, he asked repeatedly if the tank's modifications had been completed correctly. Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich died at 9:17 in the morning on January 25, 1945. His final modification, the 50th Sherman tank he had reinforced against regulations, was completed by his assistants following his exact specifications. That tank, named Aldrich's Legacy by its crew, survived 3 direct hits during the final push into Germany and returned all 5 crew members home alive. In the weeks following Aldrich's death, Army Command faced an uncomfortable dilemma. His unauthorized modifications had unquestionably saved lives. Statistical analysis would later estimate that his work had directly saved 173 tankers who would otherwise have died in ammunition explosions. Yet he had also knowingly and repeatedly violated direct orders and military technical regulations. Colonel James Patterson, who had initially looked the other way regarding Aldrich's modifications, wrote in his report, "Staff Sergeant Aldrich's actions present a profound contradiction for military discipline. He disobeyed direct orders and violated technical specifications established by our finest engineers. In doing so, he saved more American lives than anyone else in this maintenance battalion. How do we honor such a man without encouraging others to ignore the chain of command?" The solution reached by higher command was a study in military pragmatism. Officially, Aldrich's death was recorded as a maintenance accident, with no mention of his unauthorized modifications. He was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service, with carefully worded commendation that praised his dedication to maintaining armored vehicles under combat conditions, without specifying exactly what that entailed. His body was returned to his hometown of Dearborn, Michigan, with standard military honors. Unofficially, however, 7th Army Ordnance teams thoroughly documented Aldrich's modifications. By February 1945, official technical bulletins were issued to maintenance units, describing a new, approved method for reinforcing ammunition storage areas in Sherman tanks, a method identical to what Aldrich had developed. His name was never mentioned in these technical documents. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, upon reviewing the data on survivability rates, reportedly commented, "Sometimes the damn regulations need to get out of the way of winning this war. This sergeant saw a problem, fixed it, and saved American lives. That's the kind of initiative that makes our Army exceptional." For the tank crews who survived because of his work, Aldrich's legacy was clear and unambiguous. They called themselves Aldrich's Boys and held informal reunions after the war. Many credited him directly for their survival, telling stories of direct hits that would have been fatal in unmodified tanks. A quiet tradition emerged among tank maintenance crews to leave a small weld mark in the shape of an A inside Sherman tanks to honor him. Richard Daniels, a gunner whose tank took a direct hit from a German Panzer IV near Hufvudstaden but didn't explode, perhaps summed up Aldrich's legacy best. The Army never officially acknowledged what he did. His innovations became official modifications after he died, approved by the same people who would have court-martialed him if he'd lived. But those of us who came home know the truth. We walked away from direct hits that should have killed us. We got to see our families again, have children, grandchildren, lives that would have ended in those frozen forests. All because one stubborn sergeant decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations. The military's conflicted approach to Aldrich's legacy persisted for decades. His name appeared in no official histories of armored warfare innovations. The modifications he pioneered became standard in later tank designs, incorporated without attribution. It wasn't until 1972, when several tankers who had served in the Battle of the Bulge began sharing their stories with military historians, that Aldrich's contributions began to emerge into public knowledge. Today, a small display at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia, finally acknowledges Aldrich's role. A faded photograph shows a gaunt, exhausted man in grease-covered coveralls standing beside a Sherman tank. The caption reads simply, "Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich, 1919 to 1945, developed critical safety modifications for M4 Sherman tanks during the Battle of the Bulge, saving numerous lives." Next to this photo sits a piece of salvaged armor plate with a distinctive weld pattern, Aldrich's signature technique. What the museum display doesn't mention is that this piece came from the 50th tank, the one that ultimately claimed his life while he tried to protect one more crew. In the cold calculations of war, Aldrich's story presents uncomfortable questions about innovation versus regulation, initiative versus obedience, individual judgment versus organizational control. He saw men burning alive in flawed machines and chose to fix the machines rather than accept the casualties as inevitable. His methods violated regulations written by engineers who never had to pull charred bodies from smoking tank hulls. His disobedience saved lives that would have otherwise been sacrificed to technical specifications. Thomas Weller, one of the first tank drivers to receive an Aldrich modification, visited the sergeant's grave in Dearborn in 1982, nearly 40 years after the war. He brought with him a small piece of metal, a fragment of deflection plate that had saved his life when a German shell penetrated his tank but failed to reach the ammunition. Standing at the simple military headstone, Weller placed the metal fragment beside it. "I brought you this," he said to the quiet grave. "It saved my life, gave me 40 years I wasn't supposed to have. I got to raise children, see grandchildren. All because you decided we were worth saving, even if it killed you." The morning sun glinted off the twisted metal, casting long shadows across the frost-covered cemetery, not unlike those Belgian forests where a mechanic had once worked himself to death, tank by tank, man by man, saving others while his own time ran out. 173 men returned home because of his modifications. 173 families continued because one man refused to accept the limitations in front of him. Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich was 25 years old when he died. The 50th Sherman tank he modified remained in service until the end of the European campaign, its crew protected by his final work. Its distinctive A weld mark, applied by his assistants after his death, became the template for all subsequent modifications. In saving others, he never saved himself. When asked years later if Aldrich could be considered a hero, Colonel Patterson, his former commanding officer, reflected, "We have medals for charging machine gun nests and for jumping on grenades. We recognize the valor of split-second decisions. But Aldrich's was a slower sacrifice, a man knowingly working himself to death, day after day, to protect others. He never fired a shot in combat, yet he saved more lives than many who did. If that's not heroism, then I don't know what is." For the tankers who survived because of his illegal modifications, men who lived to return home, start families, build the post-war world, the answer was never in doubt. They lived because one mechanic decided that saving lives mattered more than following rules. They remembered him not as the regulation breaker who modified 50 tanks, but as the man who gave everything to ensure they would see home again. In the frozen maintenance pits of the Ardennes, working by sputtering generator light as artillery thundered in the distance, Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich made his choice 50 times over. With each tank, each modification, each burn and sleepless night, he traded pieces of himself for the lives of others. The 50th tank took what remained, but in the calculus of sacrifice, perhaps he would have considered it worth the cost. One life given so that many more could continue. The tank that crushed him carried 5 men safely through the rest of the war. Each of them came home. Each lived decades they otherwise wouldn't have had. From one man's death, countless futures unfolded. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his sacrifice. Not the life that ended, but all those that continued because of him. We measure a soldier's contribution in enemies defeated, ground taken, objectives secured. But sometimes the greatest impact comes from those who save rather than destroy, those who find ways to bring more men home alive. By that measure, a grease-covered mechanic who never saw the front lines might have contributed as much to victory as any decorated combat hero. He ensured that more Americans returned to build the peace that followed war. His innovation lived on, incorporated into later designs without credit, saving lives long after his own was lost. That, perhaps, is Aldrich's true legacy. Not the recognition he never received, but the generations that existed because he refused to accept that men should burn inside their own tanks when he could do something about it. In the quiet fields of Dearborn, Michigan, far from the frozen forests of Belgium, his headstone reads only the basic facts: name, rank, dates, service. Nothing about 50 Sherman tanks or 173 lives saved or regulations broken to protect others. But for those who know, for the families that exist because of his choice, the unwritten epitaph remains clear. Here lies a man who gave everything so others could live, who saw what needed to be done and did it, regardless of the cost to himself. The mechanic who reinforced 50 Sherman tanks died beneath the last one, but the men he saved carried his real legacy forward. In the lives they lived, the families they raised, the world they helped build. In saving them, something of Michael Aldrich survived too, echoing through generations that would never have existed without him. If, as some believe, our truest purpose is to use our skills to alleviate the suffering of others, even at great personal cost, then perhaps Staff Sergeant Michael Aldrich fulfilled his purpose 50 times over in those frozen maintenance pits. Tank by tank, life by life, sacrifice by sacrifice, until there was nothing left of him to give.